Welcome back to Court TV Live. Along with Julia Janae and Ted Rollins, we're still reacting to the Natalie Cochran guilty verdict out of the state of West Virginia. The jury will be back tomorrow to begin the penalty phase. Let's go back out. We just heard from the prosecution team. Now, Court TV legal correspondent Kelly Craft has the defense team.
Yeah, hey there, Ted and Julia. So the defense team with me here live inside the courtroom just after, moments after, the jury here returned a verdict of guilty for their client, Natalie Cochran. We are joined by Mr. Seldon as well as Mr. Victor. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Victor, I am going to start with you. Can you give me your reaction to the verdict?
My reaction is that this is exactly what happens when you don't get a change of venue. And the trial is still in progress, so we'll see what happens in the sentencing phase of this case.
Mr. Seldon, what is your reaction?
Shock,
Yeah.
quite frankly. I know it shouldn't be. I believe in my clients. I believe that our defense far surpassed the prosecution, but that's not the way it turned out. And I feel for Natalie. But again, the trial's not over.
A big issue in this case, did Michael or didn't he know this was a Ponzi scheme? The defense team put forth a lot of information. You called the children to the stand talking about Dad wore the pants. He was the one in charge. Mr. Victor, what did you think of that presentation? And the jurors obviously deciding that he did not know.
I think that we've presented so much evidence that the victim in this case was involved in this Ponzi scheme, or at a minimum, he knew about what was going on, that it's almost unconscionable for this jury to find otherwise.
Mr. Seldon, talk about the medical experts. We had the state's medical examiner saying that the cause, manner of death, undetermined. Then they had two experts that said it was from insulin. We had the manner of death from Dr. Uribe saying this was homicide. Your experts said something very different. I felt that one of the doctors, one of the last witnesses that you called, she was very credible, saying that we cannot make that determination that this was homicide. We don't know. What did you think of the experts' testimony and how that impacted this case?
Well, quite frankly, I agree with our experts in that Dr. Uribe did not follow medical protocol when doing an autopsy and reaching his conclusions. I understand that there's an opinion. That opinion has to be made on the observable evidence and the actual medical records. He guessed, and he said, oh, it has to be a homicide. As our experts clearly pointed out, you can't reach that conclusion based on the physical evidence and the actual medical records. Dr. Banerjee explained in infinite detail how insulin, that particular type of insulin, Humalog insulin, could not be active in Michael Cochran's body 8 hours or more. That type of insulin wasn't active in his body. And she went through the table of that. I thought that was clear, but clearly, I guess, the jury didn't understand that.
Mr. Victor, Natalie had said or informed the judge that she was going to testify, and then there was a change of heart. She did not testify. Can you talk with us about that? Should she have testified?
Well, that's the decision that the defendant makes based on many factors. I think our role in this case was to advise her of all the pros and cons of testifying, the risks, the benefits, the exposure to cross-examination, and all the aspects that go into a person's decision to testify. And that was her decision. We can sit here and speculate whether this was a right decision or a good decision or not. It's obviously her decision to testify or not to testify. And let me assure you, that was done after a significant amount of time spent with her and discussions concerning all of these aspects that I have just outlined.
After the verdict, Natalie was very upset, crying uncontrollably. What did she say to you, gentlemen? Anything? Nothing?
She really didn't say anything. She was just, I mean, wouldn't you be incredibly upset if you were just told you could very well spend the rest of your life in prison?
I think she was overwhelmed with the emotion of the moment and the emotion of hearing the jury verdict. But certainly this case is far from over, of course. Tomorrow we'll start the mercy phase of this case. We'll see how that goes. And I'm sure that the appeal in this case is imminent.
One of the things that you focused on, Mr. Victor, in the case is how could this have been done with the injection of insulin? You cannot just jab someone with the insulin. You made that very clear. You have to kind of grab a hold of their arm and put it in there. He would have known. That was never addressed by the state's case. That was an unanswered question here.
Let me say this. I really have no idea what evidence this jury was listening to. I think that this is one of the cases where the defense, not having the burden of proof, proved its case probably beyond a shadow of a doubt as to how, when, what, and why. And I raised that in my closing argument, and throughout the trial, it was obvious that these questions could not be answered by the state that had the burden of proof. And to reach a verdict in 2 hours, less than 2 hours, tells me that the jury did not consider all the medical evidence, that the jury did not consider these 4 questions that I asked. And I believe that this verdict right now is a travesty of justice.
One more quick question. Natalie Cochran, convicted felon. She was convicted of fraud, of defrauding investors out of millions of dollars in this Ponzi scheme. How do you think that impacted the juror's decision? Obviously, that was brought into evidence. It's prejudicial toward the defendant, but obviously the state would argue that was very probative. They needed that to prove motive. That's how they're able to bring that kind of evidence into a case like this. How do you think that impacted the juror's decision? You made it clear throughout this case, she's might be a fraud, but she's not a murderer.
Well, I'd like to make one thing clear before I answer that question, which was the state went to great lengths to state that Michael Cochran was part of the legitimate part of the business, if you recall.
Yes.
The whole Ponzi scheme was not legitimate. The whole thing was planned to bilk people out of money. That was the intent, that was the setup of it. To say there's a legitimate part and an illegitimate part is ridiculous.
Mr. Victor, one last question, and I know I asked you this earlier. Any word on if Natalie will speak tomorrow, give a statement in allocution?
I don't believe that there is any decision has been made at this point. We obviously will consider that option and obviously discuss it with our client, and she will likewise make a decision concerning her potential testimony at the mercy phase.
Mr. Victor, Mr. Seldon, thank you so much. It was a hard-fought battle, and we'll see what happens tomorrow. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you
very much.